All right, folks. So it's just about five. Thank you, Sarah. It's just about five after five. So we'll go ahead and get started. Once again, thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar, titled "The Climate and Community Impacts of Incineration," is brought to you by the Ironbound Community Corporation, also known as ICC, Friends of the Earth US, and the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, also known as GAIA. My name is Marcel Howard, and I am the Zero Waste Program Manager for the US Canada region at GAIA, and I will be your moderator for today. We also have Sarah Lutz, from Friends of the Earth US, leading our tech support today, and JV Vashaloid from Ironbound Community Corporation, leading as our chat moderator as well. So why don't we just get into it? We have a fascinating panel for today's webinar that will dive deep into the climate and community impacts of incineration. Now, this webinar is the first in a series of webinars unpacking the false solution that is incineration, including chemical recycling, gasification, pyrolysis, waste to energy, and pretty much every other name that industry has developed to push the false solution of waste burning as a solution to our increasing waste crisis. Our next webinar will focus on the financial aspects of incineration and will take place in a few weeks during mid-February. But we'll have more information to come following this webinar and over the next couple of weeks as well on that next webinar. So stay tuned. Now, before jumping into introductions of our panelists today, let me just ground us in the reason why we developed this webinar series in the first place. Now, incinerators are one of the most toxic, expensive, dangerous, and climate polluting industries that exist. Falsely advertised as a solution to our waste crisis that stems from overproduction and consumption. Incinerators not only deter funding from strategies that offer real solutions, but are manifestations of environmental racism. The most affected by their negative impacts are the least responsible for our waste crisis, which typically consists of low wealth communities, communities of color, indigenous communities, and other marginalized communities as well. Now, incinerators emit 68% more greenhouse gases, excuse me, per unit of energy than coal plants. And despite being a major contributor to the climate change, the incinerator industry stays afloat by relying on renewable energy credits, costly subsidies, and externalized costs. Now, the Treasury Department is beginning to determine whether incineration should qualify as a quote unquote zero emissions technology under the 45Y Clean Electricity Production Tax Credit. Now, if they determine it falls under this category, this would open up billions of dollars in funding for the incinerator lobby through the Inflation Reduction Act. And thus, the main goal of this webinar series is to mobilize and educate the wider anti-incineration and zero waste movements and preparation for engaging with with Treasury on this 45Y decision, which we expect to be taking shape over the next few months. Treasury has been hard at work on the 45V, I believe it is, tax credit focused on hydrogen. They have been slightly delayed, and I believe they are still working on that. So once they are finalized with hydrogen, they will be moving on to incinerators. So really, we're trying to get all of us prepared for engaging with Treasury moving forward. So now that I've grounded us in the reasoning behind this webinar series, let me introduce to you our amazing speakers for today's panel. And in the interest of time, I've shortened our bios just a little bit, but we will provide as much time as possible for Q&A at the end. So I'll try to jump through these rather quickly. First, we have Chloe Dezer. Chloe is a New Jersey native who ventured into environmental justice after graduating cum laude from Rowan University. Joining Ironbound Community Corporation as an environmental justice organizer, Chloe conducts community outreach and education on environmental justice issues such as zero waste and creating a just transition. She organizes residents to identify problems that affect them and pressures policymakers and corporations to address and prioritize those issues focused on fighting against toxic gas polluting power plants and incinerators at the grassroots level. She has a passion for making an innovative impact on environmental regulations and policy to create change, and Chloe currently serves on the New Jersey Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Thank you, Chloe. Next, we have Dr. Neil Tangri. Neil is the Science and Policy Director at GAIA, a global network of more than 1,000 organizations in 92 countries working towards zero waste and environmental justice. He is also a senior fellow at the University of California, Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy. A climate scientist and oceanographer by training, Neil has worked on a variety of issues, including waste management, excuse me, waste management, plastics, chemical recycling, waste incineration, climate finance, zero waste solutions, and informal sector inclusion, just to name a few. He has a PhD from Stanford University and holds a captain's license from the US Coast Guard. Welcome, Neil. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Ana Batista. Dr. Ana Batista is an associate professor in the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management graduate program at the New School University. Shout out to my alma mater. She is the co-director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School. She holds a BA from Dartmouth College in Environmental and Evolutionary Biology, an MA in Environmental Studies from Brown University, and a PhD in Planning and Public Policy from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. Dr. Baptista works on environmental justice policies, climate mitigation, renewable energy policies, environmental planning, zero waste systems, cumulative impact analysis, and goods movement and mitigation strategies. She is currently the principal investigator for the National Environmental Justice Movement Fellowship Program, housed at the Tishman Center. And she also serves on the Board of Trustees for the Victoria Foundation, GAIA, the Ironbound Community Corporation, and the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. So welcome, Dr. Ana Baptista as well. Again, we are so excited to hear from these panelists today. And as our panelists speak, please feel free to drop in questions in the chat that arise, and we'll try to answer as many of them during our Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Chloe to get us started. Chloe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcel. Just gonna wait to see these slides come up. Awesome. Okay. Thank you everybody for coming out today. Much appreciated. Like Marcel mentioned, my name's Chloe. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the environmental justice organizer with Ironbound Community Corporation. And I'm here to talk about environmental justice, and particularly in the community of the Ironbound in Newark, New Jersey. So one of the things that I like to ask folks when I'm talking about environmental justice in general is what environmental justice means to them. Like, what is their first interpretation of it? What do they think about environmental justice when they come into it with conversation? So feel free to drop it in the chat whenever you have that idea, concept, response. But yes, so we'll get right into it. So looking at this screen right now, you're actually looking at what we would think is the ideal visual of what Newark would look like before Dutch imperialism and colonization, right? So it's initially the historic displacement of the Lenape people, who were displaced out of the area, forced northward by Dutch colonists, and built their first settlement on Lenape land near the banks of the Passaic in the 1660s. So before the invasion, it was a large complex of tidal, brackish, and freshwater wetlands in northeastern New Jersey. And it was all marshland initially, right? It was a place where it would be able to take in all of the water, which is a good explanation as to why Newark is also now known for a lot of flooding when it was previously marshland in the beginning. It's now it turned into the 19th century, where it was an early industrial center and a hub for leather and ironworks and brewing and manufacturing. And the Great Migration and white flight to the suburbs had flipped Newark's demographic, and turning it into majority Black by the 1960s. And industrialization has brought us to include these lights into our homes and all these different things that are happening now in Newark, being known as such a hub for industry. It's a population of 300,000 people, which is New Jersey's largest city, and it has a rate of half African American, 36% Latino, and 10% white. And in the Ironbound specifically, majority of folks here are foreign-born people, and a lot of people that don't have English as their first language. So that's one thing to consider and know about Newark and the Ironbound. Going on to the next slide. So with history about community organizing, right? So we're going to be talking about how Newark and the Ironbound, and specifically with ICC, we came together as a means of hearing about the things that are going on in the community, especially talking about how toxic facilities were dumping dioxin into the Passaic River and turning it into today's largest 13-mile long Superfund site, essentially. And a lot of community members had come together to talk about this thing that was happening. And it led into environmental justice organizing, seeing how the Ironbound has been brought into an overburdened community with all of these industrial facilities coming in. And now we are able to have that mold and that foundation of having so much organizing happening over the years to defend the Ironbound from any more of these things from happening. And in this picture in particular, you can see me with the stop sign trying to advocate for stopping PVSC, Passaic Valley Sewage Commission, from building a fourth power plant here in the Ironbound, which is what they're trying to do. So here's some statistics, right? Because of the fact that our community is in a whole bunch of different things that are there, including the emissions that come from incineration, that come from having 3 fossil fuel power plants with the threat of a fourth, right? And the largest wastewater treatment plant in the region, and the largest garbage incinerator in New Jersey, actually. We have statistics like having 1 in 4 children having asthma in Newark. And on top of that, that's about 3 times the average rate of asthma in the whole country, not to mention. Oh, I see that this small, I don't know if there's a way to fix, if folks can see the slides clearly or not. Oh, okay, perfect. Just making sure. All right, going on to the next slide. Okay. So, like I had mentioned, we're in the midst of so many things happening in the Ironbound, and we have one particular street that is also known as Chemical Corridor, which houses so many different things like Darling, a fat rendering facility that is another contributor to the bad smells that we have, that burns animal carcasses and meats for creating lotions, right? And then right across the street is Passaic Valley Sewage Commission. And then along that block, you have a correctional facility and a detention center, which is also a problem because when we think about our census, right, we don't think about who may be residing in these particular areas before we add more industry into it. But here specifically, you can see our local Covanta, our local incinerator, bringing out purple plumes into the air. One of the things that we have mentioned as well is like how we make sure that we get community involved, right? So as soon as people saw this, they were taking pictures, it was in the news, and we're all asking the question of who and why is there bringing out purple plumes into the community that you can see right across the highway. A problem and a statement that was said that, oh, someone accidentally put in the wrong material of waste into our chutes and we ended up bringing up purple plume. Well, are we not checking properly what type of things are going into the trash, right? And who should be held responsible for these things? Covanta has hundreds of air permit violations that leads them to having a slap on the wrist with things such as fines. But how can we stop things like this from happening again in the future, right? So holding these people accountable for the things that they've done, and especially undermining environmental regulations, right? So Covanta Exes has emitted 10,000 tons of health-harming air pollution and nearly 7 million tons of climate change causing greenhouse gases just within 3 years, from 2015 to 2018. And those are staggering numbers to even believe from one facility, right? The communities who live in these incinerators today, like, because there's originally supposed to be one in every county, but it ended up somehow in Newark, Camden, and Rahway, which is predominantly Black and Brown communities that we are in right now. And we often go, me alongside JV actually, and New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, we do workshops where we talk about liberation from incineration and go into different communities to inform them about what incineration is and how it's impacting them directly, even though it may not be in their zip code, because pollution does not stay within the borders of where they are, right? So keep going into the next one. All right. So when we're talking about creating change, right, we are looking at legislation. We're looking at different ways to ensure that we can cement into law that things like this don't keep happening. So right to the right side, you're going to see an environmental justice law hearing that we had just recently about the environmental justice law and ensuring that we don't keep things like this happening in the future. And New Jersey's environmental justice law is specifically explaining how we can make sure that any proposed places that are coming into overburdened communities are not adding to the detriment of the environment, right? And they go through a DEP analysis and to ensure that that doesn't happen again. Going into the next one. So an update on that. We can even say that for the Clean Air Act, right now, the EPA recently spread out the news that they have proposed updates to the Clean Air Act, which will have a public comment period. And that's an opportunity for all of us, even in this call right now, to be able to talk about the concerns that we have and what ways we can improve in the environmental justice aspect of the country and even in our own communities, and bring attention to the Environmental Protection Agency about what we can do, which is phase out incineration. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chloe. I really appreciate that. And we're going to continue it moving forward. And please drop any questions you may have for Chloe in the Q&A. We will get to them. Get to that during the Q&A session at the end of the call. Now I will turn it over to Dr. Neil Tangri. Neil, pass it over
Thank
to
you very much. Okay. So I also have a few slides for you. Here we go. So let's see. How do I do this? Okay. So climate is obviously only one of many issues, as Chloe was telling us, but it's important in its own right, and it's also important because of subsidies, as Marcel was talking about in the intro. So, it should be fairly obvious that whenever you have giant smokestacks, you have a lot of emissions. Obviously, incinerators are not good for the climate. But industry is desperately trying to have us believe that incinerators are actually a climate solution. And this rests on two arguments. One is that incinerators produce quote unquote clean energy. And the second is that they avoid landfill emissions. So let's take these apart one by one. The clean energy claims, industry likes to say that there's that incinerators produce a significant amount of energy, and they call it clean energy. And these are their words about how wonderful it would be if the world was full of incinerators. But the reality is that in the U.S., incinerators produce less than 0.3% of the electricity that we use from the grid, which means the electric grid does not rely on them. It's not a significant source. And for that 0.3% of energy, they produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to take a few minutes to kind of unpack this slide. Each bar here represents a different power source. MSWI are the municipal solid waste incinerators. The one all the way on the left there, is the national grid average of all sources, including nuclear and renewables. The height of the bar represents the greenhouse gas emissions per kilowatt hour of electricity produced. So this is kind of an efficiency metric, right? For a given amount of electricity, how much emissions does each source emit? Obviously, you can tell looking at it, incineration is by far the most polluting energy source that we have. What's notable is that it's also the only source that emits very high levels of both fossil and biogenic emissions. That's the black and the brown bars. So there's a lot of confusion about this. What's the difference between fossil and biogenic CO2? Fossil comes from fossil fuels, coal, gas, and notably burning plastic, which is basically a solid form of fossil fuels. Biogenic carbon dioxide comes from organics, wood, paper, and food waste. Now, the incinerator and biomass industries like to pretend that for some reason, biogenic carbon dioxide doesn't count. Like, we're just going to make that carbon dioxide go away in our calculations. So they often don't even report it. This is one of the accounting tricks that they like to use to show that their emissions are lower than they really are. But that carbon dioxide is coming out of the stack, it goes into the atmosphere, and it heats the planet just the same as carbon dioxide from any other source, like fossil fuels. I also want to briefly point out that little yellow band that you see, that refers to methane and nitrous oxide, which are very powerful greenhouse gases. So what's the upshot? What does all of this mean? Even if incinerators do displace other energy sources on the grid, they're displacing sources that have lower emissions. So put another way, if we were to close all the incinerators and get the same energy from other sources, our emissions would actually go down, even if we replace the incinerators with fossil fuel sources. That, I think, is quite remarkable. And it really puts the lie to this idea that incinerators are a source of clean energy. In spite of this, most states actually define incineration as renewable energy. That means that utilities in those states can buy renewable energy credits from incinerators. Now, you might think, well, my state doesn't have any incinerators, it's not so much of an issue, but actually it does, because the renewable energy credits are sold across state lines. So the utility can buy RECs, renewable energy credits, issued in other states. For example, Florida does not have a renewable energy requirement, but Florida incinerators sell RECs to utilities in Minnesota and other states. And these REC sales are, I estimate, are somewhere in the area of $41 to $44 million per year. That is enough money to keep these incinerators in business. How do we know? Well, Covanta says so. And when California pulled incinerators out of its renewable energy program in California, it leads to incinerators being shut down because they're no longer profitable. So this monetary flow from the renewable energy subsidy is really critical to keeping incinerators functioning. And at the same time, it is diverting money that should be going to clean energy. So that $41 to $44 million a year is money that's not being invested in solar or wind or house insulation or other good climate programs. Now, on top of these state subsidies, as Marcel said in the intro, the incinerator industry is now trying to get federal subsidies under IRA. And so this definition of what counts as renewable energy is really going to be critical. Now, the second argument, of course, is around landfill methane. When pressed, the industry will admit that the energy generated by incinerators is really very small. But from a climate perspective, the most important thing is the avoided landfill methane emissions. And the truth is, landfills do emit a lot of methane. This is from a global report, the Global Methane Assessment. About 20% of all anthropogenic methane, that is all human-caused methane, comes from waste, primarily from landfills. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. It's about 81 times as powerful as carbon dioxide on a 20-year timescale. Now, it's true that incinerators do emit both carbon dioxide and the other methane and nitrous oxide, but generally much less than the amount of methane that would be produced by that waste going into landfills. So here's the problem with industry's argument. It's that landfill and incineration are not the only options, right? Landfill methane is generated by the decomposition of organic waste. That's mostly food waste and to some extent yard waste. And there are lots of ways to reduce landfill methane emissions by reducing the organic waste that goes into landfills. You can reduce food waste. You can get excess food to the people who actually need it and therefore address hunger. Or you can feed it to animals, or you can compost it, or you treat it before it goes into the landfill so that it doesn't generate methane. There are many, many other options. But of course, the industry wants to frame this as a simple choice between landfilling and incineration because that makes incineration look good. The landfill industry, I will say, also wants to frame it that way. And then they'll say our landfill gas collection systems will do great. And then they look better than incineration. I say a plague on both your houses. So there are lots of other things that we can do with organic waste, right? San Francisco is known for diverting 80% or more of its organic waste to compost. That compost then sells at a premium to organic vineyards. In South Korea, Seoul collects 96% of its organic waste, and that is either sent to compost or to feed animals. So other cities have had success with biodigestion, black soldier fly. There's lots of different approaches. The point is, there are lots of ways to reduce landfill methane. So that argument that if we don't burn it, it's going to go to the landfill is just not valid. And yet that is absolutely critical to the incinerator industry arguments. I want to also make one last point that's not directly related to greenhouse gases, and that is about other pollutants. States that produce a lot of greenhouse gases from incinerators also produce a lot of other pollutants from incinerators, unsurprisingly, right? SOx, NOx, particulates, mercury, et cetera, et cetera. These are all the things that have immediate health impacts. So cleaning up the greenhouse gas emissions from incinerators is also going to mean cleaning up the toxic emissions in the air that are causing immediate harm to their host communities. And I will wrap it up there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Neil. Really appreciate it. And we're moving right along. So I will pass it over to Dr. Ana Bautista.
Thanks, Marcel. It's so great to be with all of you. And I'm going to try to share my screen. Oh, wait.
Hey, Anna, do you want me to share or would you prefer to share?
I can share that way. I can just forward the slides as we go. That's all right.
Great.
All right, and let me just put this in. You all can see that. I'm going to try to put it in slide mode here, slideshow. Can you see it? All right. All right. I'll just say that, God, I miss a good trash talk with some really amazing panelists, and I see some great participants online asking great questions. You know, we're going to talk about all things, all the ways that garbage incineration is just wrong for our communities, and it's deeply personal for all of us, right? I grew up in the Ironbound, where Chloe's doing amazing work and continues to fight the good fight, but it is a fight that has come to communities, environmental justice communities around the country and around the world, and we're all implicated in it. You know, the reality is there, you know, all of our communities are woven together in this ecosystem. And unfortunately, for what most people is hidden from plain sight is impacting the lives and health and well-being of so many of our communities that have are the most vulnerable and the least responsible, as Chloe mentioned and as Neil mentioned. So I'm just going to give you a few little highlights on a little bit more unpacking of this dirty business, because it is in fact a dirty business model. We did a report at our center with GAIA quite a ways back now. Gosh, we're going back to 2019, and we did this national assessment of the municipal solid waste industry. And lo and behold, we found that it's a failing industry. It's an aging industry. And, you know, to no one's surprise, certainly not the surprise of communities like Newark, most of these incinerators are located in communities of color and low wealth communities, wherever they are located. At the time when we did the study, there were about 73 facilities, I want to say. And since 2019, 4 or 5 more have closed down. And before 2000, you know, between those years, there were 30 incinerators that were closing down. The incinerators were often built, most of them were built in the 80s and 90s. They have a 30-year life expectancy, give or take, and they're aging. So we have incinerators that are, you know, pushing up against the 50-year mark soon, some of them. And as they age, like anything else, they become expensive and difficult to maintain and operate. They're also, even though they have tried to rebrand themselves as energy companies, and now they're rebranding again to renewable energy companies. They're no longer the word waste. You will not find the word waste anywhere. They are renewable energy companies now, and that's how they're marketing themselves. And when in fact their business model really relies almost 70 to 80% on tipping fees on waste contracts. So they are very reliant on you know, what used to be a steady stream of locked in revenue from sanitation contracts. They're increasingly prone to having those contracts be not locked in for decades, and they're increasingly reliant on energy subsidies to be able to make up those profits. And at the end of the day, incinerators not only are contributing to climate change, but they are contributing right now and have so for decades to harming the health of those residents that live around them. And there are millions of community residents that live around these facilities, mostly Black, Brown, Indigenous, and low wealth communities that are facing health risks by nature of living near these facilities. So, oops, sorry. Yeah, so this is just a map showing where some of those facilities are. Again, no surprise that many of them are located in communities of color, or what we call environmental justice communities. And you can see there's quite a bit of a concentration in the Northeast, in the Midwest, and in Florida, where there was, huge garbage exports and imports, and a lack of cheap land to build a lot of landfill infrastructure. So the many communities in the 80s and 90s turned to incineration as sort of what they considered a high-tech solution to garbage, but that came at a very big cost to the communities that host them, and continue to weigh heavily on the finances. So in some cases, like the case in Detroit, these facilities were heavily subsidized by public entities, with public bonding, some of them threatening to send communities like Chester and Detroit into bankruptcy to pay off the debt financing on these facilities. So they were not good investments for communities. So it's not only poisoning their air, but it's impacting the finances of their localities. And if you want to, if you really want to nerd out on the incinerator industry, we did a little digging into the Covanta annual reports to look at their revenue streams and where they're getting their profit margins. And again, as I mentioned, and most of it is from tipping fees, but a not insignificant portion, this has probably increased over time since we last looked at it, is, there's between 15 and 20% are from electricity sales. And depending on the types of RECs they capture, it could be higher. But we also know that many of these facilities have operation and maintenance costs that run, sometimes 10 to 15% of their budgets as well. So without these subsidies, these facilities could become not economically viable. And in fact, some of these facilities that have closed down most recently, like Detroit and Long Beach, have been due to economic reasons. They're no longer economically viable. They're not profitable. And I'll just say a few words about the health impacts of incineration. There are a multitude of pollutants that come from a very heterogeneous waste stream. Despite what the industry wants people to believe, they are, garbage in, garbage out. They take in a tremendous amount of heterogeneous waste, some of which they shouldn't be burning. But, if you've ever visited an incinerator, a tipping floor, you'll see, thousands of tons of trash being tipped by hundreds of trucks a day. And they have maybe one or two visual inspectors looking for large items, perhaps a boiler that shouldn't be going in. But other than that, they are burning absolutely everything. And that mixture that Neil talked about, biogenic versus, fossil-based products, they're burning a very wide range of products, which is why you get a very uneven output on the stacks. And a lot of these facilities do not have continuous emissions monitoring required. And so they're self-reporting their emissions. And we know that incinerators tend to be one of the largest single point sources of mercury, dioxins, lead, in addition to particulate matter, and NOx and SOx and otherwise. And all of those things have significant impacts on people's health. And there's some statistics about in particular research in the EU, extensive research in the EU about mercury exposure for people living within several mile radius of incinerators that have shown impacts on birth outcomes and cancer rates and asthma statistics. So there are health impacts, although these are very difficult to track. You know, and when people ask me, well, what are the health impacts of incinerators? There has not been a, longitudinal targeted studies of incinerator impacts on the public's health done in the US. So we can suspect what the impacts would be from these emissions. These facilities are also in areas that are in non-attainment areas for other air pollution that impacts people's health. So, particulate matter, areas that are out of attainment for particulate matter, NOx, carbon monoxide, and the ozone. And so you see a huge overlap between where these facilities are and non-attainment areas. So it's just further exacerbating. This is sort of a little picture into like cumulative impacts, right? These are cumulative burdens. It's not just the incinerator alone, it's the incinerator stacked on top of already degraded air quality in these areas. And then just, it's a little aside, but maybe not totally aside. If you live in an area with an incinerator, you're also living with the heavy duty diesel sanitation trucks. And the amount of impact, this impact is usually not factored into the permitting and into the profile of these incinerators, but is very much part of the infrastructure. And they also produce significant localized air impacts for communities that have to live with fleets of trucks that number in the hundreds, like in the Ironbound, where they have 200 to 300 truck trips that are generated a day. Yeah, and you can learn more. We have a landing page there on on incinerators on the Tishman site where you could dig a little bit deeper and really nerd out on the failing industry of incinerators.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anna. I really appreciate it. And so we have a lot of rich content coming through the chats. I've also realized I was trying to answer a few, but was only sending them to our host and panelists. So I will try to copy and paste those in as well. So we have about 20 minutes, about 15 minutes, just over 15 minutes or so to have a rich discussion and answer a few of the questions that you've all put in the Q&A as well as the chat. I will turn it over to JV just to moderate some of those questions for our panelists and take it from there. So JV, I'll hand it over to you and I'll try to respond to a few others in the chat as well.
Awesome. I did share some of the questions specifically to some of the presenters in the chat. So one of the first questions we have is, are there any statewide bans on municipal solid waste incineration?
We did a report on this ages ago. I don't have up-to-date figures, but I think there were a few states that banned it, and there were others that kind of shadow banned it. They didn't come out with an actual proclamation or anything, but they ditched all the proposals. But I don't know if anyone's looked at that in a number of years.
Thank you, Neil. And for any of these questions, for any of the panelists that want to answer, and I know we have a lot of folks who have a lot of knowledge in the chat as well who have been jumping in, so please feel free as well. Our next question is, have there been health impact studies in other countries that have these facilities?
Yeah, I mentioned if you look in the report, we cite some of those studies in Italy, in France, China. China has a significant fleet of incinerators. They've done some national assessments of, in particular, the coincidence of mercury and incineration, co-location, and maternal health, child health outcomes, respiratory impacts. So yeah, there are a few places that have more longitudinal health studies that we can look at. There aren't really any in the US, unfortunately, or very many. Maybe other folks have heard of some, but as of 2019, when we were looking into those studies, they did not exist.
Thank you, Anna. And our next question, and the last one that I see in this Q&A, but I have seen plenty in the chat, is, do we have a clear picture of cause and effect? Or does the Ironbound having various sources of pollution make that impossible?
Chloe, do you want to say anything on that? You want me to take it?
And I also placed it in the chat in case it's easier to see that way, but I'll read it again. Do we have a clear picture of cause and effect, or does the Ironbound having various sources of pollution make that impossible?
Anna, you could definitely pick up wherever you feel like we should add more to it, but I feel like there definitely is a lot of cause and effect in the Ironbound that you can see. I mean, even from the presentation that I had brought in talking about how we had originally come from marshland and then going into grounds and urban heat islands and places where we have hundreds of brownfield sites because of all the industry that goes into the community as well. I feel like when it comes to various sources of pollution, making it impossible to have a clear picture, possibly. I feel like that's what they say oftentimes from like a legal aspect of it to prevent responsibility being brought upon corporations specifically. And if you have anything to follow with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge. When we were writing the report, we knew that it was going to be very difficult to, do cause and effect. It's very difficult to do for any sector in chemical and industry to say X caused Y in a health outcome, in a prescriptive health outcome. But the purpose of the longitudinal studies is to look at correlation, right? What are the possible relationships that you see when you correlate the proximity of people living near incinerators, emissions profiles, and the outcomes. And we also know a lot about the pollutants that come out of stacks from incinerators. And we know a lot about where those emissions deposit and land in terms of their emissions profile. So we can infer quite a bit, even if causation, it can't be exactly determined. And that should be enough. I mean, the burden of proof in terms of causation is too high a burden. And I think we know enough about the chemicals that are coming out of incinerators and their potential health impacts to be able to do more. And in fact, that was one of the, primary impetuses for pushing the EPA to update their incinerator regs. These facilities are putting out way too much co-pollutants into communities. So yeah.
Thank you, Anna. And I also see that Neil has a hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, as Chloe was saying, like for legal liability, like if you're going to sue the incinerator, say this incinerator gave my mom cancer or something, that is very, very difficult to establish because epidemiologists want to see one source with one chemical that causes one specific disease. And you're only really going to see that with asbestos because it has such a distinct disease profile. You look at something like dioxin, right? It is a cancer accelerant across a dozen different cancers. Now, those cancers may also, there may be joint causes with other chemical exposure for those things. And then, of course, a lot of the chemicals of highest concern, like dioxins and PFAS, we end up finding in our food supply. So for communities that are living close to the incinerator, there's a double exposure. You're breathing stuff, but you're also getting it through the food supply. And the food supply could have a long chain that's thousands of miles away. I think the key point here is that these are overburdened communities. So any marginal source of additional pollution is unacceptable there. These are places where we need to be reducing the pollutant load, whether or not you can point to a specific disease in a specific individual. Like that's not really the question. The question is, are these healthy communities? And if not, and we find that they're not because they're out of attainment of the Clean Air Act and all the other things that we've been talking about, then we need to reduce any significant pollutant load that's going into those communities.
Thank you so much. I am gonna we have a few other questions. So we have some in the chat, so I don't know if some of the panelists want to start with those. We do have two in the Q&A, which I'll read now. One of them is, the evidence against burning is so loud and clear. What are the challenges passing the message to businesses and legislators to take the right steps? Are there laws trying to ban it altogether?
Could you show, I like to see visual like questions too. Okay, awesome. I just off of the top of my head, listening to the question, yes, the evidence is very clear just based off of this webinar alone, right? When it comes to passing the message to businesses and legislators about taking the next steps, it's, I mean, one of the biggest things that I've been realizing in this work is how important public participation really is, which is why it's one of the biggest steps that I mentioned when talking about what can we do next. I personally have witnessed being in like a state house for hours on end to ensure that we don't make any type of loopholes for industries like incinerators to keep on getting through under the cracks for continuous legislation to keep them in power or give them any type of reason to use, you know, greenwashing or any type of different language to keep going on into the world, essentially. So I think that's one of the things I wanted to start off mentioning here in that question.
Yeah, the incinerator lobby is very strong. And they come under many different guises. It's not just municipal solid waste incinerators are sort of the bottom of the barrel. But they, you know, you have chemical recycling, you have plasmification, gasification, you know, pyrolysis, you know, this whole, you know, body of incineration packages that pop up everywhere. And at one point, the incinerator lobby had a model legislation that they would just go to every state house to try to get insinuated into subsidies. And so every year I would get calls from New York State folks like, oh, here comes the incinerator lobby again. Like, so they are heavily invested in renewable energy rebranding. And so while I don't know the latest stats on like municipalities banning waste incineration as municipal solid waste incineration as a waste management tool, there's a lot of conversation about how we pull them, you know, out of renewable energy subsidies and consideration as energy entities. And it's interesting because they're going around to state houses. They don't want to come under any greenhouse gas laws. So they want to be exempted from things like carbon taxes and carbon fees and, you know, anything related with greenhouse gases, but they want to be considered in the renewable energy portfolios for credits. And if we could get states to ban incineration, to not consider incineration across the board, both federally at the state level, as not a renewable, you know, not eligible as a renewable energy credit for renewable energy subsidies, that would impact their bottom line. That would ripple across the industry. If they also came under any climate mitigation laws, they would also be, you know, when New York was considering a carbon tax, and the waste incineration put out tons of media that it would kill their industry if they had to pay a carbon fee. So this is, you know, clues to us, to those of us to really go after the industry. We need to really look at the economics of how they're staying viable.
So we are, or I am, and I feel like I can speak for everyone, so excited that there's so many questions. At this point, Sarah on tech can allow folks who have their hands up or who had their hands up previously to unmute themselves for any other questions. I know we had a lot going on in the chat, and honestly, it's really cool to see everyone energized about this topic. It's a really important one to so many communities. And so if anyone would like to be unmuted, you can raise your hand.
Go ahead, Gary, you're unmuted.
Thank you. I put in the chat the question about the EPA waste management hierarchy. Many of the states follow that. They've admitted on the link that I put in the chat that there was no basis for having, quote, energy recovery above landfill, but yet it's still there. So I'm asking, is GAIA focused on that? Are others working on this? Are we going to see EPA actually base their hierarchy on fact, not fiction?
I don't know, Neil or Marcel, if you've worked on it all with EPA folks more recently, their rationale and general logic. I know we've always fought with EPA about the inclusion of loopholes in climate bills, like, when it was the Clean Power Plan, or now with the 45Y, like they sneak in there. But I don't have a good read on where EPA is on that, in the waste division on incineration lately. I know they used to have quite a few boosters for incinerators in there.
Yeah, happy to jump in there, Neil. I think the last conversation I had directly with EPA was about 5 months ago or so. And it was quite interesting. I think a few of the folks on this call were in that as well. EPA seemed to be not concerned about incineration. They sort of viewed it as an issue, particularly around 45Y, as being sort of the decision of 45 coming out because due to 45Y would sort of their expectation was that incineration would not be classified as zero emissions. Thus, EPA would then shift their thinking around incineration and adjust there. That is what we got from that conversation. They also seem to push it on other federal agencies in order to make those adjustments or those announcements regarding incineration. So unfortunately, that was about 5 months ago. I'm not sure where they stand at the moment. But again, they seem to be not concerned about incineration and felt as though it would not move much further as an agency from an agency perspective. Whether or not there was something deeper than that, and maybe they were just blowing us smoke, we're not sure. But it did seem like they were very much not concerned with incineration being classified as zero emissions, as well as gaining potential subsidies in the future. Again, that was about 5-6 months ago, so it could be different at the moment.
Yeah, and I see this question about the Danish incinerator, the Copenhagen with the ski slope on it, and like they make it, it's like the meme on incinerators that are so high tech. And it's funny because, funny story, true story, I met the Danish ambassador in the US, and the first thing I said to her is, please do something about this PR gimmick with your stupid incinerator in Copenhagen that people trot out in the industry lobby. First of all, we don't have an incinerator that looks even remotely like that in the US. Okay, we don't have that version of incinerators here, number one. Number two, your waste diversion in Denmark is like, many times better than what we have in the US. And number three, it's caused a huge problem in Denmark. She admitted to me that they are trying to phase out completely from incineration because they've become a huge importer of waste. They didn't have enough garbage to keep the incinerator viable, and they started having to take waste from all over the EU to keep the thing going. And so they had a 3 to 5 year plan to shut it down, ski slope or not. But nevertheless, the industry likes to put that out as the model. I heard the commissioner of DSNY here in New York City touting how amazing, we need more incinerators so we can send New York City waste somewhere. And this is the trope that we need to push back against with facts.
And so I just want to do a quick time check. Thanks for mentioning that, Sarah, in the chat. So we have about 2 minutes left, maybe time for one more question, and then we can close things out. Let's see. I know there are a few in the Q&A. Let me grab this. Okay, I will post this one in the chat and then read it out loud. In few words, can you generally evaluate the level of compliance support of the payment of carbon fee as agreed at COP28? Maybe yeah, Neil.
So my understanding is that COP28 did not actually agree on, there's kind of a hope of a universal carbon fee or something, but then the Article 6 is all about how to create new carbon markets. And that is continuing to get kicked down the road because there isn't agreement. The carbon markets have been a total disaster. It's a very hot topic here in California because California's relied heavily on carbon markets to meet its ambitious climate goals, and they're failing because what a surprise. People buy, not people, companies buy carbon credits from, fictional forestry projects and then use them to keep open refineries and incinerators and whatnot in EJ communities. So, so yeah, I don't think there was any substantial agreement that came out of COP28, and I don't see a prospect in the US for a national carbon fee at the moment. And in places like California, where we do have a cap and trade system, we really need to close the loopholes on the carbon market.
Awesome. Thank you, Neil. And so we are at time. And so I do just want to thank our lovely panelists once again for your amazing insights and the work you all do on a daily basis for fighting the good fight. So thank you all so much. And thank you all for attending this webinar. We hope that you all gained valuable insights into the false solutions of incineration. And as a reminder, this is the first webinar in a series of webinars with the ultimate goal of preparing the wider movement to engage with Treasury on this 45Y decision related to incineration in terms of whether it qualifies as zero emissions technology. So we will be sending up a follow-up email with webinar recording and the presentations, as well as some additional information regarding our next webinar, which will be focused on the financial side of incineration. So please stay tuned and feel free to reach out to any of us via email in the meantime if you have additional questions. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.